In the winter of 1880, beneath the smoke-choked skies of Birmingham, England, a man stood in the shadows of a narrow alley, his breath misting in the freezing air. In his arms, wrapped in a stained linen sheet, was the body of his wife. She had died only hours before, her pale face still bearing the traces of the fever that had stolen her life. But this man was not carrying her to a church, nor to a cemetery. He was carrying her to a buyer, because in Victorian England, death was not just a tragedy, it was a business, and some men were willing to sell anything, even the woman they once promised to love and protect. This is the story of the Birmingham Corpse Scandal, one of the most disturbing chapters in the dark history of body trade in industrial England. Make sure to subscribe for more chilling true stories from history. To understand how a husband could commit such an unthinkable act, we must first step into the world of Victorian Birmingham. By the 1880s, the city had transformed into one of the beating hearts of the Industrial Revolution. Factories belched smoke into the air day and night. The streets teemed with labourers, migrants, and families crammed into filthy tenements where disease spread like wildfire. Life was cheap here, death even cheaper. And in the midst of this relentless machinery of progress, a hidden economy thrived, one that traded in human flesh. Medical science was advancing rapidly during this era. Surgeons needed to understand the intricacies of the human body. Students packed into anatomy theatres, eager to learn, to cut, to dissect. But there was a problem. There were not enough bodies. The Anatomy Act of 1832 had attempted to solve the crisis by allowing medical schools to use the unclaimed corpses of the poor, those who died in workhouses with no family to mourn them. But even this grim supply was insufficient. The demand far exceeded what the law could provide. And so, in the shadows, a black market emerged. Body snatchers, known in whispered tones as resurrection men, prowled the graveyards at night. They dug up fresh graves, pried open coffins, and hauled the dead from their resting places to sell to the highest bidder. A corpse could fetch anywhere from £2 to £10, a fortune for a desperate man. Birmingham, with its sprawling slums and overcrowded cemeteries, became a hunting ground. The poor knew the danger. They told stories of graves found empty, of families discovering nothing but stones in the coffins they had buried with such sorrow. Some stood guard over fresh graves for days, armed with clubs and lanterns, determined to protect their loved ones, even in death. Others bought iron mort safes, heavy cages that encased the coffin, until the body inside had decayed beyond any medical use. But not everyone could afford such protections, and not everyone had family willing to stand watch. It was in this world of fear and desperation that our story begins. The man at the centre of this scandal was a labourer, his name lost or deliberately erased from the historical record, as if even history itself recoiled from acknowledging him. He lived in one of Birmingham's poorest districts, a maze of cramped courtyards and crumbling brick where entire families shared single rooms. He worked when he could find work, hauling goods, sweating in factories, scraping together just enough to keep starvation at bay. And beside him, through all of it, was his wife. We know little about her, only that she was young, that she had married him with hope, perhaps even love, and that she fell ill in the cold months of that brutal winter. Illness was common in those tenements. The air was thick with coal smoke and human waste. Clean water was a luxury. Tuberculosis, typhoid, cholera, any number of diseases could take root in such conditions and spread with terrifying speed. When his wife began to cough, when her skin grew pale and fever burned through her, there was no money for a doctor. Medical care was for those who could pay, and he could not. He watched her weaken, day by day, until one morning she did not wake. She was gone, and he was alone, with a body that needed burying and not a penny to his name. A proper funeral, even a modest one, cost money he did not have. The church required fees. The cemetery required fees. Even the cheapest pine coffin and a shallow grave cost more than he could gather. There was, of course, the option of a pauper's burial, arranged by the parish, but that carried a stigma so deep it was almost unbearable. To be buried as a pauper was to be marked, even in death, as worthless, forgotten. But there was another option, a darker one. He knew, as so many of the poor knew, that there were men who would pay for a body. Fresh bodies, bodies that had not yet begun to rot, bodies that could be used by the medical schools, no questions asked. We can only imagine what went through his mind in those hours after her death. Did he grieve? Did he weep over her body, running his hands over her cold face, remembering the woman she had been? Or had poverty already hollowed him out, stripped away every shred of sentiment until only survival remained? Perhaps he told himself it did not matter. She was dead. She would not know. She would not feel the cold slab, the scalpel, the hands of strangers cutting into her flesh. Perhaps he told himself that the money would keep him alive, that it was practical, that it was necessary. Or perhaps he did not tell himself anything at all. Perhaps he simply did what he had to do. He made contact. How, we do not know for certain, but in those days such connections were not difficult to find. A word in a tavern, a quiet conversation with a man who knew a man, and the deal was arranged. The price was agreed upon somewhere between £5 and £8, enough to live on for weeks, enough to matter. That night, while the rest of the city slept, he wrapped her body in a sheet. He carried her through the dark streets, past the factories and the silent houses, to a prearranged location. There, in the shadows, the exchange was made. Money passed into his hand. Her body passed into theirs, and just like that, she was gone. Not buried, not mourned. Sold. The body was delivered to one of Birmingham's medical schools, brought in through a back entrance in the dead of night. It was registered under a false name, listed as an unclaimed corpse obtained through legal channels. The students who eventually worked on her would never know the truth. They would practice their cuts, study the organs, learn the structure of the human form, and move on to the next cadaver. She became anonymous, a teaching tool, her identity erased, and her husband walked back into the world with coins in his pocket and a secret buried deep. For a time, he lived as he had before. He paid his rent. He bought food. He drank. Perhaps he tried to forget, but secrets like that do not stay buried. In the tight, gossip-filled world of Birmingham's slums, nothing remained hidden for long. Someone saw something. Someone heard a rumor. Perhaps he drank too much one night and let something slip, or perhaps a neighbor grew suspicious when there was no funeral, no grave, no mourning. However it happened, the whispers began. And once they started, they spread like fire. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of England's darkest scandals, don't forget to subscribe. It really helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this. When the rumors reached the authorities, they ignited a firestorm. The police were called in to investigate. Neighbors were questioned. The medical school was scrutinized. And slowly, piece by piece, the truth emerged. A man had sold his wife's body, not stolen from a grave, not taken from a workhouse, his own wife. The woman he had married, the woman who had shared his bed, his life, his poverty. He had sold her like livestock, like furniture, like something that belonged to him to dispose of as he pleased. The scandal exploded across Birmingham's newspapers. The Birmingham Daily Post ran story after story, each one dripping with outrage and horror. How could a man do such a thing? What kind of monster could look at the woman he once loved and see only profit? The case became a sensation, spreading beyond Birmingham to London and beyond, shocking a society that thought it had seen every possible depravity the industrial age could produce. Public meetings were held. Reformers demanded stricter laws. Churches organized burial societies to ensure that even the poorest could be buried with dignity, protected from the anatomist's knife. But the legal response was complicated. Under the laws of the time, it was not entirely clear that what he had done was a crime. The Anatomy Act regulated the acquisition of bodies by medical schools, but it did not explicitly criminalize a family member selling a relative's corpse. He had, in a grotesque legal sense, authority over her remains. The medical school claimed ignorance, insisting they had followed proper procedures and had no knowledge of the body's true origin. The case exposed the loopholes and moral ambiguities that plagued the entire system of medical education in Victorian England. Whether the man was ever formally punished remains unclear in the fragmentary historical records. Some accounts suggest he was briefly jailed, though the charges are not specified. Others hint that he simply disappeared, driven out of Birmingham by the weight of public condemnation, forced to flee to another city where no one knew his name or his crime. What is certain is that his act became a symbol, a cautionary tale whispered in the alleys and courtyards of the working poor. He became the man who sold his wife, the man who crossed a line so fundamental that even in a world defined by brutality and desperation, it could not be forgiven. But as much as Victorian society recoiled from his actions, the scandal also forced an uncomfortable reckoning. This man was not an aberration, he was a product of the system, a symptom of a society that had commodified human bodies so thoroughly that even the most sacred bonds could be dissolved by economic need. The medical schools needed bodies. The law did not provide enough. And so a black market flourished, fed by poverty, desperation, and the quiet complicity of institutions that looked the other way as long as their anatomy theatres remained stocked. The poor understood this better than anyone. They knew that death was not an escape from exploitation, but simply another form of it. They knew that their bodies, in life and in death, were resources to be extracted, used, and discarded. The Birmingham scandal was shocking, not because it was unique, but because it was so brutally honest about the logic of a system that everyone else preferred to ignore. In the years that followed, reforms were quietly implemented. Medical schools tightened their procedures. Documentation became more rigorous. The trade in illicit corpses became more difficult, though it never entirely disappeared. Burial societies grew in strength, pooling resources to ensure that no one would be forced into such a terrible choice. And slowly, over decades, the legal supply of bodies began to match the demand, reducing the need for the resurrection men and their grim commerce. But the man who sold his wife in that dark winter of 1880 was never forgotten, at least not entirely. His story lingered in the collective memory of Birmingham's poor, a reminder of what poverty could drive a person to do, and a warning of the thin line between survival and monstrosity. He remains a ghost in the historical record, a figure both pitiable and reprehensible, a man who made a choice that can never be fully understood or forgiven. As we look back on this story from the distance of more than a century, it is easy to judge him. It is easy to recoil in horror and dismiss him as a monster. But to do so is to ignore the context that shaped him, the brutal machinery of Victorian capitalism that ground the poor into dust and offered them no mercy, no safety, no dignity, even in death. His crime was his own, but the world that made it possible was built by all of them. The Birmingham Corpse Scandal stands as a dark monument to an era when human bodies were commodities, when medical progress was built on the backs of the dead, and when the bonds of love and marriage could be severed by the sharp edge of desperation. It reminds us that history is not just a story of great men and noble deeds, but also of ordinary people pushed to their limits, making choices that haunt us still. Thanks for watching, and make sure to subscribe for more.